Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Deacon Marris. Before the world went quiet, I was the guy who kept this refinery from tearing itself apart. I was the one they called when a pressure gauge spiked, when a catwalk rattled in the wind, or when a bolt started showing that telltale orange streak of rust. On paper, the job was simple. Walk the high steel, check the welds, listen for the kind of mechanical groans that meant trouble, and file reports so the suits in the front office could sleep at night. The stack I live on now wasn't a home back then. It was just line item 4 on a maintenance checklist: north process chimney, 250 feet of vertical steel, platforms every 20 feet, an external ladder that iced over in December, and no known structural defects. I climbed it twice a year, strapped into a harness, snapped a photo of the top flange for the file, and came back down fast enough to grab a stale coffee before shift change. None of us looked up and saw a fortress. We just saw part of the skyline, a tall, dirty shape spitting steam over the chemical plant. The real work, the loud work, happened down on the concrete. That's where 18-wheelers backed into loading bays with beeping alarms and shift supervisors argued over delivery schedules in the control room. I didn't wear a badge, stripes, or a gun. I carried a heavy canvas tool bag and a Motorola radio that never stopped crackling with static and complaints. Nights, weekends, holidays, it didn't matter. If something groaned when it was supposed to hum, I was the guy driving through the gate, swiping a plastic ID card and going up into the dark to see what was about to fail. When people talk about the end of the world, they picture Hollywood stuff: air raid sirens, convoys of soldiers, and presidents making big speeches on TV. That is not how it started for me. It didn't happen with a bang. It started with small, boring glitches that felt like nothing in the moment. A missed check-in call from a driver, a confused, garbled incident report from the night shift, a security camera showing a movement that looked jerky and wrong. By the time we truly understood what we were staring at, the city was already burning, and the ground level was past saving. I knew one thing for damn sure. I did not want to be down on that concrete when the last heavy doors gave way. The day it finally turned for us at the refinery didn't feel like the apocalypse arriving. It just felt like a bad shift change that wouldn't end. Inside the control room, the air was recycled and stale, smelling of ozone and floor wax. Malika sat at the main console with a cold coffee that had been sitting there for 3 hours. Her eyes locked on 3 monitors full of scrolling flow rates and temperature readouts. Outside the reinforced glass, the yard lights cast sick yellow beams across the wet concrete, the pipe racks, and the dark looming line of the north stack. It was that heavy hour of the night when people cut corners to finish early, and machines whined under the strain, but for a long time nothing on the board screamed danger. It was just the hum of the plant ticking over. What pulled my eyes up wasn't an alarm, but a flickering feed on a secondary monitor linked to a camera over loading bay 7. The tanker on the screen sat a little off the dock line, crooked like the driver had given up halfway through the maneuver. The brake lights blinked on and off in an uneven, jagged rhythm. Red, dark, red, dark. The driver's door stayed shut. There were no loaders, no spotters, no clipboard guys walking around it. Just the truck pulsing in the dark. Malika saw me looking, rewound the clip 10 seconds and watched it again. "He's been sitting like that 5 minutes," she said, tapping the desk with a pen. "Dispatch called twice. He's not picking up." The yard speaker crackled to life, carrying the gate guard's voice across the concrete with that metallic echo you get in industrial lots. "Bay 7 tanker, kill the engine and step out of the cab," he said. "You're blocking inbound traffic." The brake lights glowed bright red once more, held for a second, then went dark. The cab did not move. We watched the guard walk into the frame. His safety vest reflected the overhead floods, bright yellow against the gray. He walked with his shoulders hunched against the cold, annoyed. He climbed the dock steps and hit the cab door with the meat of his fist, a solid thump we couldn't hear but could feel. When that did nothing, he tried the handle. The door mechanism clicked, and it swung open a few inches. He leaned in to yell at the driver. Then everything changed. His shoulders stiffened, locking up. One hand went to his radio, fumbling for the mic, while the other stayed gripped on the doorframe. The man in the cab slid forward like a puppet with cut strings, heavy and lifeless. His forehead hit the steering wheel. The horn blew in one long, flat, oppressive note that seemed to vibrate even through the camera feed. The guard grabbed the driver's shoulder to pull him back. The driver turned his head toward him, slow, jaw loose, neck rolling like there was no muscle left in it. We did not see teeth land. The angle was wrong. But we saw the violent jerk in the guard's arm and the dark stain that instantly started to spread down the sleeve of his yellow jacket. He stumbled back out of frame, clutching his forearm, disappearing into the blind spot between the truck and the wall. Malika's plastic pen snapped in her hand with a sharp crack. "That's blood," she said. Nobody in the room argued. It wasn't oil, and it wasn't shadow. Within seconds, the radio net filled with overlapping voices. It was a mess. A supervisor yelled for the guard to get to medical immediately. The safety officer cut in, asking if this was a seizure, a heart attack, or an assault. They used words like incident and contact, the same sterilized words we used for chemical spills and bad air quality readings. Nobody said the word bite. It wasn't in the vocabulary, but other calls followed fast, stepping over each other. A worker had gone down between two storage tanks and tried to clamp his teeth on the first medic who knelt beside him. Another guard reported a man walking straight into the closed perimeter fence, bouncing off the chain link and doing it again over and over like he couldn't feel the impact. Malika checked her phone between system checks, her face pale in the monitor glow. The news feeds were scrolling fast now. Headlines mentioned a hyper-aggressive flu, crowded emergency rooms, and violent incidents spreading through the city center. She played one clip showing a chaotic crowd outside a hospital door. On mute, they just looked angry, shouting at glass doors. Then a man in the center of the mob dropped, vanished under the feet, and rose again near the edge of the frame. He didn't stand up. He scrambled over the hood of a taxi on hands and knees, moving like an animal while people backed away in a ripple of panic. By the time the first shift started to pull into the main lot, I didn't need the news feed to tell me the world had broken. A surveillance camera over employee parking showed a compact car stopped diagonally across two spots with its driver door hanging open. A second car had rolled into its rear bumper and rested there, crunching the plastic. The driver of the second car sat behind the wheel with both hands locked on it, eyes staring straight ahead at nothing. A third car turned in from the street, saw them, paused, and backed out over the curb without even trying to park. We were prepared for industrial disasters. Storms, refinery fires, high-pressure gas leaks, total power loss. We had thick, color-coded binders for all of it. But I mentally scanned those pages, and none of them said what to do when people walked into fences on purpose or tried to tear the meat off the hands that helped them. There was no checklist for people stop acting like people. I left the main floor and went up to the small security camera room over the loading docks to get a cleaner view without the noise of the control room. From there, a bank of 4 monitors showed the bays, the main yard, the entry gates, and the back lot. The tanker at Bay 7 still sat with its cab door open. No one stood close to it. A long dark streak on the concrete marked exactly where the guard had dragged himself away. On the west side, the man at the fence had finally stopped hitting it. He stood with his forehead pressed against the galvanized mesh, fingers hooked through the wire, motionless. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. 2 more shapes drifted along the access road behind him, slow and unsteady, feet dragging on the asphalt. Back in control, the regular TV broadcast had flipped to an emergency feed. A calm anchor read a script while a red banner rolled under his face. It told people to stay indoors, avoid close contact, and specifically not to go to hospitals unless directed. That last line cut deeper than the rest. In every drill we had ever done since the Cold War, hospitals were the answer. They were the safe zone. When the official script started telling you to avoid the doctors, the answers were gone. Malika watched the banner for a full loop, her face hard, then looked at me. "If they lock the roads, nobody's coming in or out," she said. "No trucks, no buses, no shift change. We get whoever is behind this glass and whatever is in that yard. That's it." Rafe's voice crackled on the internal channel from the crane bay, sounding tinny and distant. "You want me to stop lifting?" he asked. "Yard looks wrong. 2 tankers crooked and 1 guy wandering around in socks." "I don't like a load swinging over that." I grabbed the handset and told him to park the hook and wait. There was no reason to move tons of steel until someone decided who, if anyone, was actually in charge on the ground. He said, "Hook's parked," and the line went quiet. Inside the fence, the plant kept doing exactly what it was built to do. Pumps hummed in the basement, pipes stayed hot to the touch, and pale white exhaust drifted from the north stack into the cold night air. But outside the fence, whatever passed for order was slipping fast. We still could have walked away then. The highway on the monitors was slow, red light heavy, but not totally jammed yet. No one had ordered a hard lockdown. Going home, grabbing a beer and bolting the front door was still an option on the table. But on the yard monitor, the north stack stood over all of it, a straight, uncompromising line of steel and ladders rising out of the maze of pipes. Houses had thin drywall and too many ground floor windows. That stack had height, 1 narrow way up, and a platform high enough that the problems on the ground looked like ants. That was the first moment I stopped planning around the floor exits and started thinking about the climb. We had maybe an hour, 60 minutes of borrowed time, where walking off-site and driving away was still theoretically possible. Nobody said that out loud, of course. You could just feel the window closing, pressing in on the glass. Security tried to shut the main outer gate, but a jagged row of cars blocked the exit lane with doors hanging open and engines still running. The guards kept blowing their whistles, sharp, frantic bursts, as if noise alone could fix drivers who were not listening anymore, or wake up the ones slumped over their steering wheels. Inside the main building, the plant manager stayed on the radio repeating the same 3 useless lines. Temporary disruption, stay at your posts, and avoid panic. Meanwhile, the police scanner on Malika's desk told the real story. It talked about city streets lost to mobs, emergency crews pulling back to safe zones, and 1 major hospital they were trying, and failing, to hold against a tide of patients who weren't just sick, but hungry. Malika turned the scanner volume down low and watched her control board, her face illuminated by the green glow of pressure readings. I watched the camera wall. On the yard feed, the tanker at Bay 7 still sat crooked, its cab door gaping open like a broken jaw, with a dark, wet streak on the concrete where the injured guard had dragged himself away. On the perimeter fence feed, a man leaned his forehead into the chain-link mesh and gripped the wire with both hands. He wasn't climbing. He wasn't backing away. He was just stuck there, vibrating against the metal in a way that didn't look like any confusion we had ever trained for. I kept looking at the failing numbers on Malika's screens and the failing people on mine and said, "How long can you keep this place running if the whole yard turns into that? Not just 1 bay, Malika, everything." She didn't look away from her board. Her fingers hovered over a pressure valve switch. "I can keep the units hot for a while if I baby them," she said, her voice tight. "If nobody out there starts twisting valves at random. But if the operators walk out, or the roads close for real and the supply trucks stop, this stops being a plant. It turns into tons of hot metal and pressurized gas with no hands on it." I nodded once, doing the math in my head. "Forget output for a minute. Forget the schedule. Tell me 1 place on this site with a single door we can trust. 1 entry point." She rubbed her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a faint smudge of grease. "The storm bunker has 2 main hatches. Control room has 4 exits. Maintenance has a rolling bay door and glass on 3 sides. Why are you counting doors instead of telling me to start a controlled shutdown?" I pointed at the roof camera feed, usually just a view of gravel and vents. "Because none of those rooms are off the ground. The north stack has 1 base hatch, 1 external ladder, and platforms like steel shelves all the way up. Once we are high enough, Nothing walks to us unless it can climb frozen steel in the dark. She finally turned, following my eyes to the tall shape of the stack cutting through the low gray clouds on the monitor. "You want to live on a maintenance ring," she said, skeptical. "Instead of in a room with walls that don't move in the wind?" I shook my head. "I want to live somewhere that doesn't fill with people in 10 seconds every time a door swings open. Ground level is lost ground now. Up there, we decide who gets close. We decide when." The control room door opened hard and Rafe stepped in. He looked rattled. His crane gloves were shoved in one pocket and there was a dark, oily smear on the sleeve of his jacket. He glanced at the monitors, saw the crooked tanker, the stalled cars in the lot, and the man twitching at the fence. "Yards wrong," he said, his voice flat. "One guy at the rack went straight for a driver's face when they tried to pull him up. Just snapped at him. 2 more went over a handrail trying to run, and nobody out there is getting to their car without stepping in blood." He followed my stare to the stack camera and added, "You're thinking up instead of out, aren't you?" I didn't bother to deny it. High steel, 1 ladder, solid concrete base. If we get food, water, and material up there while we still have grid power, we can skin the rail with sheet metal, close the wind off, and ride this out someplace where the screaming is far away. Rafe thought for 2 breaths, the way he always did before he moved a 20-ton load over someone's head. He was calculating risk, weight, and angle. "We have the overhead crane," he said finally. "There is a chain hoist bolted to the stack frame where it punches through the roof structure. There is a lay-down yard full of scaffold tubes, sheet metal, lumber, and empty drums nobody is ever going to sign for again. If we start hauling now, the machines do the work. If we wait until the power cuts, we carry every pound up a ladder in a storm." Malika grabbed a notepad and started drawing quick boxes instead of arguing. She pointed at 3 of them with her pen. Crane feed, stack hoist, and north substation. If I keep these 3 alive on the grid now, and then bridge them to 1 emergency generator after the grid dies, you get a short window. Maybe hours. A time where you can still lift heavy things after the rest of the city goes dark. But we burn diesel nobody is going to refill. That is the trade. I saw the line she was drawing, a lifeline. Water from the cafeteria and vending machines, I listed. Dry food from the storage cages, propane cylinders, welding blankets, and hand tools from maintenance. Tarps, rope, anything that blocks wind or holds heat. All of that rides your window. Rafe nodded. If we are building steel walls and cutting drums into stoves, we need Jonah. I want his eyes on any weld near my bed. I agreed. Rafe keyed his radio. "Jonah, you near a ladder?" The reply came with a hollow clank of metal on metal somewhere behind him. "West rack," Jonah's voice came back, staring at a weld that doesn't matter anymore. "What's with the sirens?" Rafe glanced at me once, then said, "We are going up the north stack. Deacon wants to turn one of the high platforms into a box we can live in. It is that or take your chances in the parking lot. You in or out?" Jonah didn't take long. "If it is higher than teeth and you can get material there without asking me to hump it up every rung on my back, I am in. Crane stairs?" Rafe answered, "Crane stairs," and killed the call. We moved then, fast. Staying in that room while the radio traffic broke apart into panic felt worse than any climb in the cold. I grabbed my harness, my lanyards, a heavy tool belt, and a rope bag because habits that kept you alive before do not vanish just because the world is having a bad day. Malika took a handheld radio, spare batteries, and the master keys to the north substation so she could keep power directed where we needed it the longest. Rafe clipped his pendant controller to his chest. Jonah met us halfway across the plant floor, his own harness slung over one shoulder, and fell into step without asking for another briefing. We were leaving the brain of the plant and heading for its spine. The crane stairs finally put us above the worst of the noise. As we climbed the steep graded flights along the corrugated bay wall, the panicked shouts from the yard dropped away into a dull, rhythmic rumble under our boots. Down there on the concrete, people were still running between stalled trucks and locked doors, trapped in the panic. Up here, the steel handrails shook in our gloved hands. The air turned sharp and thin, and the massive dark cylinder of the north stack filled the high windows like a monolith. At the top of the bay, a short vibrating catwalk led to the roof hatch and a gray industrial cabinet bolted to the block wall. Malika opened the cabinet with a brass key that used to mean routine monthly checks. She stared at the breakers for a second, then started flipping switches with a snap. "I can keep this section alive for a while," she said, tracing a line on the schematic inside the door. "Crane, stack hoist, and a few perimeter roof lights. Everything else can go dark without cooking the wrong lines." Rafe set his heavy hand on the hatch wheel, checked that we were all clipped in and with him, and said, "Then we move steel while we still have a switch to throw. Let's go." The cold air hit us like a physical blow as soon as the hatch groaned open. The roof was a vast spread of gravel, tar, and ductwork, with the north stack punching straight up near the center. It was wrapped in support braces, service ladders, and a narrow ring of graded platform where it cleared the building's roofline. Below, the yard lights threw pale, sickly bands across the vents and pipe runs. Beyond the fence line, the city glow on the horizon looked wrong. Too much orange fire, too many dark patches. But that was not the part we could touch anymore. We did not waste time staring at the apocalypse. Rafe went straight to the roof edge above the open crane bay, pointed to a heavy I-beam that crossed near the stack base, and said, "That beam is our rail. I can bring the main hook under it." Jonah looked from the beam up to the high platform suspended in the dark and back to me. "You really plan to sleep up there?" he asked. I tightened my harness straps. "I plan to sleep somewhere they cannot walk to in 10 seconds, I said. I clipped my lanyard to the nearest structural tie-off point and started sorting the pile of gear we needed first. Rafe eased the massive yellow crane hook up through the open bay roof and over the roofline. He moved it slow and steady, feathering the controls so the block didn't swing in the wind. We caught it with taglines, wrestling the weight, and walked it toward the stack until the block hung directly under the beam he had picked. Jonah climbed onto the lower support frame of the stack, boots seeking grip on the rivets, and found the old chain hoist still bolted to its bracket, the one we used for hauling inspection gear. He pulled on the rusted mounting bolts with a wrench, rocked the chain hard once to test the anchor, and called down, "Hoist holds! Chain runs! It will lift more than I trust above my head, but it will lift." The first load was scaffold components. Steel frames, cross braces, and planks went into a wire basket strapped tight with ratchet straps so nothing could walk out during the lift. The load rode the crane from the bay floor up to the roof level. From there, we manually shifted each heavy bundle to the chain hoist hook. Jonah ran the chain, hand over hand, and watched the metal rise slowly along the side of the stack until it reached the chosen platform high above. It wasn't heroic work. It was just steady, grinding labor. A clean win every time dead weight moved on steel cables instead of on someone's spine. We kept at it until our breaths came in thick white pulls and our hands ached deep inside our insulated gloves. Malika kept the roof lights on even as blocks of the plant below dropped into total darkness one by one. Each time a section of the yard went black on her remote panel, she checked the power feeds and said over the handheld radio, "Crane is still fed. Hoist is still fed. Ignore the rest." When there was enough scaffold material on the high ring to actually matter, I clipped in and took the external ladder. The higher rungs had a little give to them. Nothing unsafe, just enough flex to remind me exactly how far down the concrete sat. The wind picked up and the air bit harder with each set of 10 rungs. By the time my boots hit the graded circle of the platform, my cheeks burned with windburn and my fingers had that dull, rhythmic throb that comes right before real numbness sets in. Up close, the platform was smaller than it looked from the roof. A narrow ring of galvanized grating wrapped the round shell of the stack, just wide enough for 2 people to pass if they turned sideways. There was a waist-high rail, a solid kick plate to stop tools from falling, 2 small electrical boxes bolted to the shell, and then just open sky. Nobody had ever meant for a human to live here. That part was entirely on us now. Jonah stood with one boot on the pile of scaffold frames and one hand gripping the freezing rail. He watched me clip my lanyard to the lifeline, gave a short nod, and said, "Feels like a hallway. Even without walls, it's tight." I stepped to the rail, looked out over the dying plant and the rows of stalled vehicles near the perimeter fence and said, "A hallway we conceal is better than a parking lot we cannot control." He let out a breath that steamed in the red light of the obstacle beacon, then said, "Then we start by making sure the hallway does not peel off the chimney when the wind hits." We used the last of the ambient light to set the first vertical posts. Frames went up at the outer edge of the platform, tied back to the stack shell with steel couplers and short runs of pipe so the new steel and the old steel would act like one rigid cage. Each post got 2 horizontal braces and a diagonal for stability. Each clamp got a wrench and then a second pull to be sure. We left one gap where a door would eventually go and marked it with yellow tape so we wouldn't close it by accident when we were tired and working on autopilot. By full dark, we had a rough circle of steel skeleton around us, open to the sky but solid at the feet. Malika's voice came over the handheld, cutting through the wind. "The grid is gone. We are on the backup generator alone. I can keep the hoist a while longer, but the crane is finished unless you want to pour diesel into it like water." Rafe answered from the roof that he was parking the hook and locking it off. Then he would climb up to join us. The first night on the stack did not feel safe. It felt like standing on a narrow balcony bolted to a building you did not trust, hoping the trouble stayed on the floors you had left behind. Still, when I looked through the scaffold bars and saw the yard full of dead engines and shapes that did not walk right, there was no version of this where staying at ground level had ended better. The platform shook once under a heavy gust, then settled, and I put my gloved hand flat on the stack shell. I matched my breathing to the slow, steady hum of the metal under wind load, because that was the only thing left on site that still behaved exactly the way it was supposed to. Morning on the stack didn't come with birdsong or the usual hum of highway traffic. It arrived with the brutal reality of cold steel pressing into my shoulder and a biting wind pushing through every single gap we hadn't managed to close yet. I woke up lying on the bare grating with my back jammed against the curved shell of the stack, my harness still clipped tight to the safety line, and a layer of frost coating the sleeve of my jacket. Jonah was already awake, sitting a few feet away with his knees pulled into his chest to conserve heat. He looked at the gray sky and said, "If we do not skin this ring before real winter hits, we are going to freeze solid up here long before anything manages to climb this high." I flexed my fingers inside my gloves, working them until the deep ache turned into a clumsy, prickling feeling. "Then today is about walls and fuel," I said, my voice raspy. "We can talk about everything else. Food, comfort, rules, after we stop the air from cutting straight through our ribs." Rafe pulled himself over the last ladder rung a little later, his cheeks bright red from the exertion and the cold, his breath coming in thick white clouds. He set a small cardboard box by the inner rail. "Coffee," he grunted, "from what is left of the cafeteria machines. It was hot when I poured it. Now it tastes like it slept on the roof, but it's caffeine." Malika's voice crackled over the radio while we huddled around the cups, drinking the lukewarm sludge like it was fine wine. "Generator is running clean," she reported. "I can feed the stack hoist and a few perimeter lights, but the main crane stays off unless you want to burn diesel like it is free water. Tell me what you want up there while I still have a switch to throw." We made a priority list standing there, shivering with our cups in our hands. Sheet metal went first because it was light, it turned the wind, and without it, we were exposed. Scaffold boards came next so we wouldn't be walking on open grating when the ice formed. Slipping on steel meant a long fall or a broken bone, and neither was an option. 2 clean 55-gallon drums for stoves were third, not because we would fire them today, but because cutting them on the ground with power tools made more sense than trying to swing a torch or a hacksaw this high up in the wind. A pallet of water jugs and a heavy cage of canned food rounded it out. Anything heavier went on a second page marked "later," because we had no idea how long Malika could keep the hoist alive before the generator coughed its last. Rafe dropped back down to the roof level and moved like he had moved loads his whole life, slow, deliberate and clean. From the platform, we watched him walk the heavy crane hook along the roof beam, lower it onto each pallet, and give a short, sharp hand signal before Malika lifted. The crane carried the weight from the bay floor to the stack base. That was the easy part. The old chain hoist took over from there. Jonah worked the chain, his eyes locked on every shackle and link as they groaned under the load. When a pallet came level with the platform, swaying slightly in the updraft, I caught it with a tagline, pulled it in hard, and we broke it down immediately into pieces small enough to stack tight against the shell and the rail. It was heavy, repetitive work, but nobody complained. Every pound of material we landed was a pound we didn't have to carry on our backs later. Once we had enough corrugated metal on the platform to matter, Jonah started framing the outer ring. He was a welder by trade, and he built things to last. He set vertical tubes along the rail, braced them back to the stack shell with couplers, and ran horizontal pieces at knee, waist, and shoulder height. Each clamp got a wrench and then a second. Hard pull to be sure. Each joint had to be solid because we did not want to come back up here in a hard wind at 2 a.m. to fix a twist with numb hands. I drilled holes through the sheet metal and the steel tubing while he held the panels flat against the wind. The drill whined, spitting hot metal shavings that vanished instantly into the void below. Rafe climbed back up and worked the other side, adding neoprene washers and nuts until the sheets sat tight and stopped rattling. We skinned the structure from the bottom up so any gust pushed the panels into the braces instead of peeling them off. We left small gaps near the floor level to let us sweep ice and spilled water out. And we cut a few narrow horizontal slots higher up to give us a way to look out at the horizon without standing in the open wind. Malika checked in around noon. "City feeds are totally gone," she said, her voice flat. "All I hear on the scanner is one looped message telling people to stay indoors and wait for assistance that isn't coming." Later she added, "Fuel gauge on the generator says maybe 2 days at this load if the tank was really full, so plan for less. When it dies, it stays dead." By mid-afternoon, my arms shook every time I lifted the heavy drill. But most of the circle was closed, and for the first time, the wind slid along the seams of our new walls instead of cutting straight through us. The difference in temperature was immediate. Heat was next. Rafe wiped grease from his forehead and said, "I pulled 2 clean drums and a crate of iron pipe fittings from maintenance before I shut the bay. They are tied off at the roof. Say when, and I will start them up the hoist." Jonah looked at the bare drum we had dragged up earlier and nodded. "We cut a firebox door in one, run the pipe out through a hole high on the wall for a chimney, and keep the other drum as a backup. Any more than that, and we turn this ring into a flue and smoke ourselves out." I agreed. "We fire them hot when we have to cook or melt snow, and low when we can. Heat buys time, but smoke tells every hungry thing for 5 miles exactly where to look." Fuel for those stoves would not grow out of the concrete. There were no trees here, just industrial waste. Pallets, crates, broken desks in the training rooms, and boxes of forms nobody would ever read again. While Rafe and Jonah kept hanging steel sheeting, I went down to the roof, walked a tight loop through the closest office rooms with my harness still on, and filled a heavy canvas bag with what we could lift in one go. It was strange being inside the building. It was silent, the air still smelling of toner and floor cleaner. I smashed pallet slats to length, stripped chair frames of their foam cushions, and broke narrow shelving units into pieces. Every piece of wood I dragged back to the hoist was one less reason to go back inside later when the halls got dark and the smell got worse. It felt like vandalism, destroying the place I'd worked for years. But the job description had changed. We weren't maintaining the refinery anymore. We were scavenging its bones. By the time the light thinned and the sun dropped behind the city smog, the platform felt different under our boots. It was still just a steel ring bolted to a taller cylinder, but the terrifying open drop at our backs had turned into a rough corrugated wall in most places. Where the morning had given us open sky and vertigo in every direction, the evening gave us thin, controlled slices of the horizon through our planned gaps. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot, But when the first flakes of snow blew sideways past the slots, they did not land straight on our faces. That small change meant we could work a little longer, last a little more, and start thinking of this place as the beginning of a fortress instead of just the top of a smokestack. Every load we landed, every bolt we tightened mattered up here. We were building a world we could actually control. The snow showed us exactly where our new walls were lying to us. It sifted through the thin gaps between the corrugated sheets, left pale, ghostly lines on the floor grating, and melted in dark, wet rings where the stack shell still held residual industrial heat. Wherever the flakes piled up in corners instead of blowing past, we knew we had a problem. We patched those leaks with scraps of metal and duct tape until the draft dropped from a knife edge that cut the skin to a slow, manageable leak we could stand. Jonah waited until the ring was mostly closed before he cut the first drum for the stove. He set it on 2 heavy scaffold boards to insulate the floor, drew a neat rectangle near the base with a piece of soapstone, and said, "Door goes low so the heat stays in the belly of the drum and the coals get air from underneath." Rafe braced the barrel with his full weight while Jonah ran the battery-powered reciprocating saw. The cut screamed once, a high-pitched tear that echoed too loud in the quiet air, and then it was over. Jonah bent the steel flap open with pliers, trimmed the sharp edges with a file, bolted on a simple latch he'd made from scrap, and drilled a round hole high on the side for the stovepipe. That pipe was critical. It would push smoke and carbon monoxide out through the wall instead of letting it build up where we slept. We picked a spot near the outer edge where a flue could pass between the wall braces without touching anything flammable. Jonah drilled through the heavy skin of the wall, fed the galvanized pipe out, and screwed a plate of scrap metal around the gap to seal it. From the yard below, that little pipe would look like just one more line of hardware on a tall tower. From our side, it was the thin line between heat that kept us moving and exhaust fumes that would quietly poison us in our sleep. The first fuel was pallet wood. Rafe had cut the slats to arm's length on the roof before the crane died. I carried them in, stacked them dry against the stack shell, and said, "We burn hot and clean first. If there is any paint or chemical coating in that steel drum we do not want in our lungs, it goes now." Jonah built a tight bundle of wood with crinkled paper from an old safety checklist under it and lit it. The flame caught fast, the drum ticked as the metal expanded, and a small, blessed wave of warm air rolled across the cold platform. Malika came up the ladder with her collar pulled high and her gas meter in her hand. She held her gloved fingers out to the heat, watched the digital display on her device, and said, "No CO leak, no spike in the bad numbers. You just bought us hours we would have spent shaking in the dark." I nodded, staring at the orange glow through the draft holes. "Then we treat wood like food. No fires just to stare at them. We burn for heat, not for comfort." She looked at the small pile of wood and answered, "Fine, but you need more fuel here before the offices rot or burn down there. The generator is ticking." We made one more desperate run through the closest rooms while the hoist still had power. Training chairs, break room tables, cheap particle board shelves, and heavy pallets turned into pieces that fit the stove. Anything that burned and did not stink like chemical sealant went into the bins. We clipped them to the hook and let the hoist climb, load after load. When the last heavy basket cleared the rail, Malika's voice came over the handheld and she said, "Generators at a quarter tank. The hoist gets one more heavy day, maybe. After that, whatever you want up there moves with a hand crank or stays on the ground forever." Water needed a plan next. The jugs and bottles we'd raided from the cafeteria and vending machines looked good stacked by the shell, but they wouldn't last a week. The roof snow was cleaner than anything in the plant's process lines, but it needed processing. Rafe and I took 2 plastic storage bins down to the roof and scraped fresh snow off the ductwork and empty tanks. Full bins rode the hoist up. Empty ones came back down. It was dull, freezing work, but every load turned into gallons of water we didn't have the day before. Up top, Malika set a small rocket stove on a flat spot and balanced a clean-cut drum over it as a boiling pot. She burned the pallet slats hot and watched the steam rise. "No raw snow," she ordered. We melt it, bring it close to a boil to kill anything in it, and put a lid on. We poured the hot water into jugs, taped dates on the sides with masking tape, and stacked them against the stack shell where the residual heat stayed just warm enough to stop them from turning back into solid blocks of ice. Food was simple math. The cafeteria had sacks of bulk rice and dried beans, jugs of oil, salt, and a walk-in freezer of meat that would not stay safe with half the plant dark. We stripped the freezers first, hauled up what we could carry, and cooked heavy for 2 nights. We ate steaks and burgers cooked over the drum stove, gorging ourselves on protein instead of pretending we could save it without refrigeration. It was a strange, grim feast, eating high-quality food with dirty hands on a steel grate. After that, it was cans from storage and whatever snacks hadn't been smashed in the vending machines. Malika wrote 3 lines on a piece of cardboard and taped it above the stove. Calories first. No raw meat. Bulged cans go over the rail. By the end of the 3rd day on the platform, the ring felt less like loose scaffold and more like a narrow, functional room wrapped around a chimney. We had a stove that drew clean, walls that turned most of the biting wind, water we could drink without guessing if it would kill us, and enough dry food under tarps that we could think in weeks instead of hours. Cold and hunger had dropped 1 slot lower on the list of things trying to kill us. That night, we set a real watch schedule. Malika took the first shift by one of the high slots with a pair of binoculars and a radio. She kept her voice low and said, "If we are staying, we learn how the ground moves. I want to know if they patrol or just wander." Rafe picked a spot by the floor hatch, laid a short steel pry bar and a heavy hammer within reach, and tied a rope to the inner rail to secure himself while he slept. Jonah checked the new frame one more time, tapping clamps and bolts with his knuckles, listening for rattles, then lay down near the warmer side of the drum with his harness still clipped to the lifeline. I walked the full circle, counting panels and anchor points, checking the integrity of our cage. Then I stopped by a narrow viewing slot and looked down. The yard sat in deep shadow, broken only by a few dying emergency lights. Cars lay at wrong, violent angles near the main gate. 2 shapes moved between them, jerking slightly as they walked. Another stood at the fence with its hands on the mesh, motionless. They were far enough away that their sounds, the moans, the shuffling, did not reach us. That distance was the only reason sleep felt possible at all. When dark settled for good, the platform found a rhythm. 1 person watched the world die. 1 stayed near the hatch to guard the door. 2 rested or handled small jobs that did not need full light. We spoke when we needed to, and saved our voices when we did not. From the road, the stack looked like any other winter night, a tall, dark cylinder with a faint trace of exhaust near the top. But from inside our ring of metal, it had become the only place left where closing your eyes did not feel like a mistake you couldn't take back. The first full storm hit before we were ready for it. The wind slammed into us from the west, hard and relentless, making the stack shell hum under our boots. The ring shook on the worst gusts, not much, just enough to make us look at each other and then at the braces we had bolted on in better weather. Snow came in sideways, finding every thin seam in our new walls. It stacked in corners and along the floor, showing us exactly where the drafts still lived. We treated the storm like work. Snow that slipped through the gaps went into bins instead of over the rail. Every bin was water we wouldn't have to dig for later. We scraped it up, melted it in the cut drum over the rocket stove, and poured it into jugs. Malika wrote dates on the plastic with a marker and stacked them against the shell, where the metal stayed just warm enough to keep them from turning solid. The stove ran low and hot to save wood. Pallet slats burned faster than any of us liked. Watching that pile drop felt like watching a clock tick down. Jonah moved slowly along the ring with 1 hand on the braces. After 1 long gust, he tapped a clamp with his knuckles and said, "Nothing slipped yet. If anything is going to fail, it will start by talking, so we keep listening and we do not pretend a new sound is normal." That was the rule he lived by before any of this, and it still made sense here. On the 2nd night, the generator coughed under the floor. The sound came up through the metal like a misfire in your own bones. Malika looked toward the hatch and said, That is not a sound I want with this wind. If that engine quits now, the hoist goes with it, and whatever we did not lift stays down there until spring or never." She pulled on her gloves, zipped her jacket, and added, "I am going down. If it can be fixed, I want hands on it before it decides for us." I clipped in and said, "You and Rafe go. I stay with the stove and the hatch." Jonah shook his head once and said, "If the mounts have torn or a line is cracked, you want my tools on it, not yours. Deacon, your job is this ring. Ours is the noise under it." They took the ladder down, and the platform suddenly felt emptier than the storm alone had managed to make it. Wind smeared snow across the panels and made the stovepipe twitch. I walked the full circle and checked bolts by touch, counting my steps just to have a sound that wasn't the storm beating on metal. The refinery below had turned into shapes and shadows. The yard lights were gone. Tanks and pipe racks showed only as darker blocks against a gray smear of sky. The radio hissed twice before Malika spoke. Her voice came tight and fast. "Fuel line was half frozen," she said. "We thawed it and bled the air. I can give you the hoist and a few lights for one more stretch, but after that I shut it down or we kill the engine and lose the last diesel for nothing." I exhaled slowly and said, "Then we use the hoist while we have it and stop pretending that power is a long-term friend." By morning, the worst of the wind had blown itself out. The roof had bare patches where gravel showed and hard drifts where anything stuck up. The yard looked flat and wrong. Tracks from the last people who had tried to leave lay half-buried, curling from doors to cars and then into open white. A sedan near the gate sat with all 4 doors open and snow piling on the front seats. 3 figures stood near the fence line with ice on their backs, swaying a little each time the wind pushed. We used the remaining generator time on things that would still matter after the noise stopped. Rafe and Jonah rigged one final heavy lift from the roof, drums of scrap, bins of broken furniture, and pallet wood. That would be fuel when the neat stacks of slats ran out. The hoist groaned as the load climbed but kept moving. Malika watched the gauge and called up, "That is it. I am killing the feed before we end up with a dead engine and no way to move it or run anything." When she threw the breaker, the low hum under the floor faded and did not come back. No power meant no more hoist or roof lights. We would move heavy things the hard way now. 2 days after the generator finally went quiet, the frantic rush for cars and gates burned itself out. From the narrow viewing slots in our walls, we watched the yard settle into a slower, heavier kind of dead. Groups of people turned into pairs, then singles, and finally just scattered shapes that wandered aimlessly between stalled vehicles and circled industrial doors that would never open again. On the 3rd afternoon, without the hum of engine noise, 2 new figures walked in from the tree line toward the main service road. One leaned hard to the right side, favoring a leg, but still forced one foot in front of the other. A smaller shape stayed close, a small hand wrapped tight in a strap on the bigger one's pack. They stepped onto the plowed path that led toward our building and kept a straight line, moving like they had chosen this specific place on purpose. I watched them close the distance until I could clearly see the adult's worn coat and the kid's oversized jacket. I turned my head slightly and said, "We've got 2 on the south approach. One grown, one about 10. They aren't moving like the rest." Jonah left the stove and joined me at the wall. He followed my line of sight and said, "Adults favoring that leg. Kids doing half the work. That's either stubborn or bad." The closer they came, the easier it was to see faces. The adult was a woman in a dirty winter coat with a heavy backpack hanging low. The kid looked small but steady beside her, eyes fixed up on the stack instead of on the dangerous ground. The woman kept scanning the ring like she could stare a door into existence halfway up the chimney. I slid the slot wider and let my voice carry down through the cold air. "Stop at the bend and don't come closer to the building," I said. The woman flinched at the sound, pulled the kid in tight for a second, then raised her face toward us. She lifted both hands clear of the straps and said, "We see you. Please don't shoot, just talk to us before you decide." There was no weapon in her hands and nothing obvious on the kid, but the way she held herself said she was braced for bad news. I kept my eyes on the road and said, "What's your name?" She answered, "Elise," and added, "This is my daughter, Nora. We came in from the east on foot. I've been watching your stack from the trees for 2 days trying to decide if anyone actually lives up there or if I'm just freezing us for nothing." "Anyone with you?" I asked. Elise shook her head once and said, "Not anymore. We were 3 when we left the last block. One got sick and dropped fast. The other took our last running car and the food while I was asleep. If someone is behind us now, they're not with me on purpose." She kept her hands up and her eyes locked on the ring. The kid tightened her grip on the strap and stayed quiet. I watched their breath fog in the air and said, "How long since either of you were bitten, scratched, or covered in anyone else's blood?" Elise answered immediately, "No bite and no scratch on her. I took a hit on my leg 3 nights back when something came out of a stairwell faster than I was ready. I killed it and I've cleaned the cut every time we stopped." She did not reach down to show it. Jonah saw that and said under his breath, "If it was clean, she'd have that pant leg up already." I kept my tone flat and said, "If I let you inside and you're wrong about that injury, everyone up here pays for it. We have 1 ladder and no backup plan." Elise nodded once, accepting the logic. "I know where you are. You're sitting in a ring on a tall pipe. If I turn halfway up, I trap all of us. I would not have brought my kid to your ladder if I thought it was likely, but I'm not going to swear it is nothing while it still burns." She took a slow breath and added, "I am asking one thing. Take her. You can throw me back to the snow if I'm a risk. Just don't leave her down here alone with this." The kid finally spoke then. She leaned in against her mother and said, "Mom, stop," low and sharp. But she did not step away. We pulled the slot down until only a thin view remained and stepped back into the center of the ring. Jonah stared at the floor grating for a second and then said, "If you haul both of them up, we either get lucky or we do something ugly in a space the size of a hallway. If you only take the kid, you live with that choice, but the rule stays the rule." Rafe came over from the hatch, listened without looking out, and said, "Cold down there finishes her either way. Up here, if she turns slow, she finishes us first. You know how that goes." Malika stayed quiet until we both watched her. Then she said, "Your rules since we climbed were simple. No bites on the platform, no question marks in the room. We do not bend that now because it hurts more to keep it straight. If you break it once, you'll keep finding reasons." None of them liked what that meant, but nobody had a better answer. I went back to the slot, opened it to the width of my hand, and said, "Elise, listen to me. I'm not bringing you up here. That leg is a question we can't afford. I can take your daughter. I can check her, feed her, and keep her off the ground, but you do not climb." Elise took the words like a physical hit. Her shoulders dipped and she closed her eyes for 1 long second, then opened them and said, "If that's the only offer, we take it." Nora looked up at her fast and said, "We," like she could drag her mother into the word by force. Elise shook her head, kept her hands up, and said, "You go where there's heat and food. I've been running on fumes and lies for days. This is where that ends." I told her what had to happen next in one breath, so I could not soften it. "You set your pack on the ground in front of you," I said. "You walk Nora to the base of the stack and leave her at the ladder. Then you walk back to the bend and keep walking until you're out of sight. If you come back toward the ladder after that, I treat you like any other threat on the ground." She did not argue. She unbuckled the pack, set it down slow, took Nora by the shoulders, and said something we could not hear over the wind. Then she guided her toward the concrete base of the stack. Rafe was already moving by the time they reached it. He went down the internal ladder with a rope tied off to his harness and a second safety line clipped to the rail. Jonah waited at the hatch with a thick wool blanket. When Nora reached the first rung, she looked up once, then climbed with stiff, careful movements while Elise stood back at the bend and watched. We did not speak while the kid climbed. When her head came through the hatch, Jonah stepped in, took her wrist, and pulled her the last stretch onto the platform. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, kept his hands where she could see them, and said, "My name is Jonah. We're going to check you for cuts and get you warm." She nodded once and said, "I'm Nora," like she was reporting for a shift instead of being dropped into a new life. Rafe came up behind her, closed the hatch, and slid the locking bar into place. I went back to the slot one last time. Elise stood where the road bent away, coat whipping in the wind. She saw the hatch close and gave one small wave, not high, just enough that we could not pretend we had missed it. I said, "You need to go now, because anything softer would have broken the line we were holding." She answered, "Take care of her," turned without looking back and walked into the white until the wind and distance took her shape from us. When I turned from the wall, Nora was sitting by the stove with the blanket tight around her and Malika's hand on her shoulder. The room felt smaller with one more person in it and a fresh gap where a mother used to be, but the rule had held. We had taken in one more life without inviting the one risk we could not fix, and from this height that was the only kind of mercy any of us could still afford. Nora changed how the ring felt just by breathing in the same space. Before she came up, the only small sounds were tools settling in the cold, the steel ticking as it cooled after sunset, and the heavy thud of our boots on the scaffold boards. After she arrived, there was the soft scrape of smaller footsteps and the light, rhythmic tap of a pen on plastic when she counted jugs or cans. She watched more than she talked. When she was unsure, she copied what we did and waited to see if anyone told her to stop. We gave her work that mattered but couldn't kill us if she slipped up. Malika handed her a permanent marker and said, "You put one line on every jug we fill and write the day I tell you. If a jug has no mark, we skip it. We don't guess with water." Jonah showed her how to stack wood so the dry pieces sat closest to the stove door. "Big on the bottom, small on top," he said. "If someone grabs wrong in the dark, we waste heat, and heat is time." Rafe took one slow watch with her, pointing out which shapes below still moved with purpose and which were just frozen piles of clothes and bone. Nora slept in the warmest wedge of floor we had, tucked between the stove drum and the curve of the stack shell. We ran a safety rope in front of it so no one stepped on her in the dark. The first few nights, she woke from short, hard sleeps with her hands clenched and her eyes wide, staring at the corrugated ceiling. She never said her mother's name. She just asked once, quietly, "You're not going to send me back down there, right?" Malika answered without looking up from her logbook, "No. Once you're up here, you stay unless you decide to go on your own." Days blurred into a gray loop. We scratched one short chalk line on the inside of a wall panel for every sunrise we survived. Snow covered the roofs below, melted in thin bands where hot steam lines still ran underground and froze again into black ice. The yard filled with drifts and dead vehicles. At first, we still saw people try to move between the buildings. After Nora arrived, that stopped. Anything that crossed the open ground now either walked wrong from the start or didn't get up again after it fell. Supplies dragged us back to hard numbers when time stopped meaning much. Malika spread our inventory lists on the board she had bolted to the shell and said, "If we keep eating like this, food lasts 3 more weeks. Wood for the stove matches that if we stay low. Water is fine while snow keeps falling. When it warms up and the roof dries, we have no tap and no well." Jonah tapped the fuel column with a dirty fingernail. "We can stretch it if we only burn hard when we cook and work. No more idling the fire just so it feels nice in here." Stress climbed with the cold. Rafe snapped once when a length of pallet wood slipped from his grip, bounced off a brace and hit the hatch frame. He grabbed it, shoved it violently back into the stack and said, "We hauled every board up here and then we almost pitched this one over because somebody is lazy with their hands." His voice hit harder than the wood had. Later, he sat by the stove with his elbows on his knees, staring at the grate. 10 years I told people to move slow under the hook," he said. "Now I'm watching our fuel drop the same way and there's no new truck coming." Then he moved his gear to make sure Nora had the best spot by the drum. Jonah turned his worry toward the frame itself. He walked the ring after each hard gust of wind and checked the clamps by touch. Once he jerked awake at a new creak, smacked his head on a steel brace and said, "Good. If it hurts, I'm still here." Then he went around again with his wrench in the dark. It didn't change the steel, but it kept him from sitting still and building worse pictures in his head. I took most of the late watches. Standing at a slot in the small hours felt easier than lying down and letting my brain replay every choice we had made to get here. From up there, the city was just a flat, dead smear on the horizon. No headlights, no moving windows, no sirens, only darkness and the occasional dull orange glow when something burned far away. It was quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt like the world was holding its breath. One night, while I watched the lot, Nora came over with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "It's louder when I lie down," she said. "Can I stand here instead?" I slid over so she could reach the viewing slot. "You can, but clip your harness and keep one hand on the rail." She stared down at the white snow and the dark metal for a long time before she asked, "Do you think she made it anywhere that isn't like this?" I didn't pretend I didn't know who she meant. If she found a place that still holds, it's because they made hard rules and kept them. Same as we did when you climbed. Nora was quiet, then said, "So if she knocked on their door, they probably told her no too." I answered, "Maybe. We talked once about leaving for real instead of just saying someday." Malika started it. She sat by the board one evening and said, "If food and wood keep dropping like this and if the snow stops, we either climb down while we still have enough in us to move, or we decide this ring is home for warm months too." Rafe shook his head. "Down to what? The last time we saw the highway, it was already jammed. Anywhere we walk on the ground is just more of that with worse odds." Jonah rubbed his jaw, the stubble thick and gray. "We built this to beat cold and teeth. Heat and smell are different enemies. You close this box in July and we might cook ourselves." Nora listened from her corner and finally said, "I don't want to sleep on a floor again where something can hit the door. If you go, I go, but I don't want to." They all looked at me because from the first climb this had been my call. I ran my thumb over the chalk lines that marked our days and said, "We don't go down just because we hate the view. If we leave the stack, it's because we know exactly where we're headed and what waits there. Right now, this place has walls, heat, water, and rules we trust. Everything out there is guessing and hoping." Nobody liked that answer, but nobody had a better one to put on the medal. The choice to stay wasn't one big speech. It was a line we kept not crossing every time the ladder came up in talk. We patched new leaks, counted jugs, moved wood from the last full bin to the next empty one, and kept the watch going. When I counted the chalk marks and saw we were close to 30 days since we shut the hatch on the ground, the number didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like proof that for now, the high steel still belonged to us and that we weren't ready to trade it for any street we couldn't see. On the 31st morning, the radio finally broke its maddening loop of dead air. A live voice cut through the static hiss and said, "If anyone can hear this within 10 miles of the North Industrial Corridor, this is Tower 9. We have height, heat, and secure floors. We're taking in survivors who can reach us on their own." Malika was on watch with the volume set low. She sat up instantly. "That's our strip," she said, then handed me the handset when I raised my hand. I said, "Ask where they are and how many." She keyed the mic and spoke clearly. "Tower 9, Refinery stack platform at mile marker 6, 5 alive, 1 child. What's your position and head count?" After a stretch of static, the voice came back, sounding relieved but tired. "Refinery stack, we read you. We're 3 miles east of the old beltway on a broadcast mast. 10 adults and 4 kids, 1 diesel generator. If you can get here, we can put you inside something that doesn't flex in the wind." Rafe heard that and said, "4 kids and floors that don't move sounds better than this ring if they're straight." Jonah frowned at the shell and answered, broadcast mast means tight ladders built for techs, not 20 people with packs. Nora pulled her blanket closer and asked, "Do they have to climb as high as us?" Malika said, "If they're on a mast, they're high enough." A few short calls back and forth told us they had done the same thing we had on a different piece of steel. Pulling food from vending machines, running stoves through broken glass windows, hanging heavy blankets to cut drafts, and burning more diesel than they liked just to stay warm and talk to ghosts. When the channel went quiet again, I turned the volume down and said, "They've got more bodies and more floors. We've got fewer people, one ladder, and systems we wired ourselves. If we walk over there, we trade a place we understand for a place where we're the unknowns." Rafe leaned on a brace and said, "We'd also give Nora 4 other kids instead of 3 tired adults." Malika pointed at her board and said, "Food runs out here and there. Our weak point is wood, theirs is fuel. If their diesel dies while we're halfway, we lose both." Jonah ran a hand along the warm stove drum and said, "We spent a month making this ring behave. Climbing into their setup means learning every weak point the hard way." Nora looked up and said, "If we go and it's wrong, we can't just come back before dark. I know where it creaks here and where not to step." We talked it through like a job instead of a fight, weighing stay against go the way we used to weigh crane lifts. We thought about load weight, distance, weather, and what happens if something lets go halfway. By the time the light went flat gray outside, Malika had rough numbers written under both words on her board. The column under go was tighter and meaner than the one under stay, full of dangerous assumptions about no storms and no wrong turns on the ground. I looked at the chalk marks where we had been counting days and said, "We're alive because we picked one place, learned it, and fixed what we could reach. If we walk into their mast now, we take their margin and hope they never have to choose between us and someone else." The stove ticked. The stack shell gave one low, metallic pop as it cooled, and finally Malika said, "I can live with staying and I can live with going. I won't flip a coin. We call it on the numbers." Jonah nodded and said, "Numbers say we last here longer than they last on that generator if nothing else hits first." Rafe let out a breath and said, "Nothing else hitting us is the part I don't buy, but I don't see a line on that board that says move and win." Nora looked from the shell to me and said, "You told me to pick a place and learn it. This is the first place that didn't try to bite me in my sleep." In the end, the call sounded smaller than it felt. I keyed the radio and said, "Tower 9, Stack Platform 6. We read you, and we're glad you're up there, but we're holding our height. Ground between us and you is too open with the kid on the line. We won't ask you for a ride you can't give." After a long pause, the voice came back. "Copy, Stack. Hold what you've built. If this shifts and we're both here, maybe we trade plans instead of people." I set the handset down. The ring looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Walls, stove, a narrow room wrapped around a chimney. But now everyone inside knew we had seen another option and turned away from it on purpose. That night on the late watch, the yard lay white and silent under us. I kept a hand on the rail and stayed where we had chosen to stand. 30 days on the stack didn't make me fearless. It just made me honest about what scares me and what I can actually fix. The ground still messes with me when I picture it. All those unlocked doors, blind corners, and ways for people to rush you faster than you can think. Up here, the threat is simpler. Cold, height, metal, and time. You can work with those if you pay attention and don't lie to yourself. We didn't turn the platform into some kind of castle. It's still just scaffold wrapped around a chimney with a stove made from an oil drum and a wall of sheet metal that rattles when the wind hits it wrong. It leaks a little and it creaks when the stack shifts in the cold. Sometimes the stove smokes until we clean the pipe. None of that makes it useless. It just means we never put the wrench down. Most days follow the same rough loop now. We wake up in pairs so nobody is ever on the floor alone. One person checks the frame while the other feeds the fire. Nora tracks the wood and water and marks the board with simple shapes instead of long notes. A full circle means full. Half a circle means we start cutting furniture again. A line through it means we go downstairs for more, whether we want to or not. Malika listens to the radio in short windows and turns it off when all she hears is dead air and the same recorded warning. We still hear human voices sometimes. Some are recordings that never stop telling people to stay inside. Every once in a while, a live voice cuts through, thick with static, asking if anyone is out there with a safe room or a working truck. I answer when I can. I say, "We're high, not mobile. We can't take passengers. Look for height you can reach and close off space instead of opening it." It's not the answer anyone wants to hear, but it's the one that won't get them killed chasing our ladder. Nora has stopped asking if her mother is coming back. She asks different questions now. How long can metal stay up in the cold? Or, what happens if the stove cracks? I give her straight answers. Steel lasts a long time if you don't let the rust eat it. A stove that cracks gets patched if the break is clean, or shoved over the rail if it's not. If you are listening to this from an apartment, a shop, a parked truck, or some other building that was never meant as a shelter, pick a place you can actually hold. Don't chase the perfect bunker. Find one good door you can see, one set of stairs you understand, one roof you can reach without crossing open ground for an hour. You don't have to do everything at once either. Fix what you can reach with your own hands. Set simple rules and write them where tired people cannot miss them. Keep your water as clean as you can make it. Boil more than you think you need. Treat heat and light like they're food. Use them hard when they keep you alive, but turn them down when they just make you feel better for a minute. Don't expect anyone to come and fix your building for you. If you stay, you are the maintenance crew now. If you have to let someone in, ask questions you are ready to act on. How long since they were hurt? Who did they leave behind and why? Look at their eyes when they answer. Look at their hands. You can't save everyone who reaches your door, and trying to will just get you and everyone behind you killed. Save the ones you can and accept that some choices will never feel right. Just because it hurts doesn't mean it was wrong. Up here on the ring, we count days in chalk lines, wood scraps, and water jugs instead of calendars. As long as the frame holds, the stove burns, and the rules make sense, we stay. If that changes, we climb down with what we can carry and look for the next piece of high ground that will put up with us. Until then, this is our place. A narrow room around a tall stack that didn't give a damn who owned it until someone finally did the work. If this story helped you pass another bad night or a long shift on watch, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who keeps one eye on the stairs. Drop a comment where you're listening from. Stay warm, stay higher than the worst of it, and listen when your gut tells you it is time to move before the floor decides for you.